Good evening. I'm Bill Kovich, the curator of the Neiman Foundation for Journalists here, and I want to welcome you to the 13th annual Joe Alex Morris Lecture. Joe Alex Morris was a graduate of Harvard, class of '49. He was killed covering the 1979 revolution in Iran while on assignment for the Los Angeles Times. This lectureship was established in his name by his family, his Harvard classmates and friends, and his fellow journalists. Each year we invite a foreign correspondent who represents the qualities of integrity, dedication, and intelligence which mark Joe Alex Morris's own work to deliver this lecture. Our lecturer this year is Deborah Amos, ABC News correspondent for Turning Point, ABC's primetime news program, which premiered on March the 9th. Before joining ABC, Ms. Amos spent 16 years with National Public Radio, and during that time, she won every major award possible for a radio journalist for her work both here and abroad. Deborah Amos represents the new generation of women who have moved so surely and so firmly into the forefront of foreign reporting in recent years. Her reports of the civil wars and the famines in Ethiopia and Somalia, her reports from the field during the Iraq War, confirmed her as one of the most incisive and reliable correspondents reporting from that region. As one of the first American correspondents to try to unscramble the story of Yugoslavia as that country ripped itself apart, she injected a voice of restraint and moderating intelligence in what was often a babble of confusing and misleading information. It's a special pleasure to bring home one of our fellows from the Neiman class of 1992. Would you please welcome Deborah Amos?
It's quite remarkable to be back here. I spent a wonderful Neiman year at Harvard, and I haven't been back since, so it's especially nice to be here tonight. And it's also important to be here to give this lecture for a couple of reasons. Although I didn't know Joe Alex Morris, he was important to me in my first years as a foreign correspondent. He had been killed a few years before I arrived in Beirut, Lebanon, but he was already a legend. In the summer of 1982, most of the old-timers in the Beirut press corps had known him, and he was regarded as one of the best. But the story of Joe Alex Morris was also a story that a young journalist paid attention to because it was a story of a colleague dying while on assignment. When you cover wars and mayhem, that thought is always in the back of your mind. And the stories that I had heard about Joe Alex were instructive. One of the first pieces of advice that I heard that summer during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon was that he had always worn a baseball cap when he covered a war. And it was his ritual. It was a way of separating himself from the local residents. The idea was that if the combatants knew that you were a journalist, then you would be safe. They needed us there then, and they wanted us there to document whatever carnage, whatever injustice, whatever dispute was going on. Joe Alex Morris was a fine journalist, and he wrote interesting, in-depth coverage from Beirut. At the time, it was one of the most dangerous cities in the world, but the luck of that baseball cap ran out in an apartment room in the outskirts of Tehran. As Bill told you before I stood up to speak, it was in the year of 1979, and it was an accident. He was covering a fight between the Iranian military and the people who were supporting Ayatollah Khomeini. And it was a bullet to the heart, and colleagues saw him slump to the floor. I looked up the last story that Joe Alex Morris wrote, and I had it faxed to me in Sarajevo a couple of days ago. It was an analysis piece, and it was a good one about American foreign policy at the time. It was a real time warp to read it. It describes a world that seems remarkably simple considering how the world looks now. At that time, the Carter administration had no clear policy to deal with the collapse of the Shah's government in Iran. The only way to bolster America's other important ally was to send a squadron of fighter jets to Saudi Arabia. It was a message to the Soviet Union to not meddle in the region, and it was very quaint to read it. It was particularly interesting to read it in Sarajevo. I had arrived there on a United Nations plane. A flak jacket is a requirement to get on board those planes. And it's a necessity that wasn't the same for Joe Alex in Beirut, because Yugoslavia, ex-Yugoslavia, is a war that has targeted civilians and targeted journalists. A few days earlier in Sarajevo, I had hitched a ride with the CNN contingent. We were all on our way to the daily briefing that the United Nations gives at the telephone building in downtown Sarajevo. And when the door of the CNN armored car swung open, it's a vehicle that looks like a brink truck, there was Margaret Moose, a camerawoman who had spent a lot of time in Sarajevo, as well as some time in an American hospital. Last year, her jaw was shattered by a sniper's bullet as she was leaving the country. And there she was again in the back of the CNN van with her camera on her way to the briefing. A few hours later, the CNN van dropped me off and I went upstairs to the ABC office, which is where I was working out of this time. And there was Tony Bertley. And Tony Bertley had just come back from a town on the front line called Olivo, and he was limping a bit. He was badly injured last year when he was hit by mortar fire in the town of Srebrenica. You may remember that story. Srebrenica is a small town in Bosnia. It's on the northeastern part of the country. And it was a town that had been under siege for more than a year. Tony was one of the few correspondents who got into the town. He stayed there and he broadcast material out of that town after UN General Philip Morion had declared that he wouldn't leave the place until the siege was broken. Eventually, Srebrenica became a safe area, and for Tony's pains in Srebrenica, he was hit with a mortar shell and evacuated out. A few days after I saw Tony, I left Sarajevo and I went to Split in Croatia, and I ran into Patrick Bishop. He's a reporter for the Daily Mail in London, and Patrick has spent almost 2 years covering Bosnia. In the last year, he has concentrated on the war between the Muslims and the Croats, one that was every bit as vicious as the earlier parts of the war. He was badly wounded when a mine was detonated as he was walking by. A flak jacket protected him from the worst of the blast, but shrapnel wounds kept him out of Sarajevo for a couple of months. He was back. Well, what all of this reminded me of is baseball caps and goodwill are no longer the St. Christopher medals for journalists. Foreign corresponding has changed dramatically since those days in Beirut. In most cases, there is no goodwill. More than 36 journalists have died covering the war in Yugoslavia. It's the highest toll for any war of similar duration. Reporting on the collapse of the old world order has been hazardous as well. In the last year, Alexandra Tuttle, a stringer for the Wall Street Journal, was killed in the Republic of Georgia when a civilian plane, was shot down. And Rory Peck, a cameraman I knew in Afghanistan, was killed in front of the television station in Moscow when he was covering the coup this year. Now, you probably wonder why I'm reminding you of all these stories of death and injury. But in some way, this is a yearly speech in honor of a journalist who died trying to bring accurate and in-depth coverage to a story. And so I thought that the reason the reason I wanted to bring up these other names is because it also should be a moment to remember how it is out there for people who are trying to do the same thing as Joe Alex Morris. Another reason why I wanted to focus on foreign correspondents and their travails is that the profession of journalism is becoming more dangerous at precisely the time that the limits of journalism are becoming more apparent. I first ran into the phrase, the CNN curve, in an article in The New Yorker last year. It was a long piece about the undercurrents of the Balkan War and the failure of European and American diplomacy. The name gave a title to a phenomenon that I had observed at the end of the Gulf War. The definition was precise, as the New Yorker always is: a torrent of pictures of dismembered or tortured innocents that could create pressure for using whatever it took to halt the violence. Foreign policy by popular moral outrage. The CNN curve described what appeared to motivate first Western European governments and then the Bush administration following the successful end of Desert Storm. That conflict rooted the Iraqis out of Kuwait, but it also prompted the Kurds in northern Iraq, as well as Iraqi Shiites in the south of the country, to revolt against Saddam Hussein. The Iraqi Kurds had been fighting Saddam for years, and they had themselves been the victims of a systematic genocide. But for the first time, there was a chance for a real revolt. The country was in chaos. At the same time, there were plenty of Western television cameras in the region. The Gulf War was over, and the story took on a momentum of its own. I was based in London at the time, and the first pictures of the Iraqi army decimating the populations in the cities of northern Iraq, the images of thousands of refugees on the march towards the Turkish border, provoked an outcry in Britain. Before long, those same pictures were showing up on American television, and they were getting the same reaction. The politics of that uprising was not understood very well by the viewing public, but the pictures were clear enough. A response to that revolt wasn't part of the game plan for the alliance that had shown such remarkable cohesion during Desert Storm, but public reaction was swift and strong. And governments were scrambling to fashion a policy to stop that slaughter and stop the pictures on the evening news. Operation Provide Comfort was born out of that experience, and what we got was a no-fly zone in northern Iraq, a refugee policy, a humanitarian aid policy, and a trip by the then Secretary of State, James Baker. It was the first time that the CNN curve had kicked in, and it was a moment when the power of television journalism was at its height. In Britain, at least, government ministers began to complain that they were no longer free to consider a policy, but they were forced to react under the weight of public opinion. The CNN curve was still in operation by the time that President George Bush sent U.S. Marines to Somalia. That country had the misfortune to fall apart in the opening days of Desert Storm. Somalis in Mogadishu could listen to foreign broadcasts of that first march into Kuwait as their own despot, Siad Barre, was opening up the arsenals in the capital as a last-ditch effort to arm and distract the very militias that would bring about his downfall. As Somalia moved into chaos, a man-made famine began to decimate the population, and the pictures of the starving were beamed back to the living rooms of American homes. It was another torrent of pictures. Hungry innocents again created the pressure to use whatever means it took to halt that misery. The pressure led to the dispatch of the U.S. Marines, and one of the most remarkable moments in relations between the American military and the American media. As the Marines rose up out of the surf on the Mogadishu beach, armed and prepared for the evils of the capital, they were greeted by the blinding lights of television networks, winking out the night scope goggles used for the first wave of those Marines. For Washington, it was Somalia that activated the corollary of the CNN curve. If the first rule of the curve was that torrent of pictures, then policymakers in Washington understood that the second torrent of images was likely to be of body bags containing young soldiers being unloaded in some home port. These images were likely to create a reverse spin, and with it, political retribution. Somalia was supposed to be the first and the best test of peacekeeping in the New World Order. For the first time, the United Nations Security Council had agreed to an operation under Chapter 7. And what that meant is the blue helmets could use force. And at the same time, there was a nation-building component to the operation. It was a recognition that Somalia was much more than a humanitarian operation. The reason for the suffering was a result of the absence of a working government. However, the Somali operation was soon to end in failure under the second rule of the CNN curve. European governments had already learned the lessons of the CNN curve and were the first to get out ahead of it. The war in ex-Yugoslavia was their classroom. The European press in France, Germany, and England hammered away at government policy that allowed genocide to continue unchecked. Each night, the television screens were filled with the images of that horror, of refugees fleeing from the worst of ethnic cleansing. This time, no one could say that they didn't know. Television reporters filed with the same passion that had driven them on the mountaintops of northern Iraq. The print reporters filled the newspapers with background reports on the history of the region, analysis, and insights. Public opinion began to build. But this time, the reactions were different. In Washington, Paris, Bonn, and London, the old fear of appeasement had given way to a new fear, and it was the fear of a quagmire. That fear came at a time when institutions like the United Nations and NATO were unable to handle the crisis, atrophied from their roles during the Cold War. Western governments complain about the power of television images to shape policy, but the truth of the matter is that Western policymakers have learned to get out ahead of those pictures. Now, governments not only see the risks of action rather than the risks of no action. Last year in Paris, while covering the French elections, I had an opportunity to talk to a policymaker in the French Foreign Ministry. I'd been puzzled by a French announcement some months earlier of French unilateral action in Bosnia. It was a curious policy announcement that was never carried out, and I wanted to know why that they had made it at all. The official was rather proud of the story and was certainly willing to share it with an American reporter. He told me that they decided to make the announcement when public sentiment for action in Bosnia was becoming unmanageable. The threat to go it alone focused French attention on the cost of involvement, he told me. The pressure was released, he said, and the French could pull back on a new commitment. Very simple. In Somalia, the death of more than a dozen American soldiers closed down the Somalia operation and ended a certain phase of UN peacekeeping. A few weeks ago, in February, a single mortar shell in the marketplace in downtown Sarajevo seemed to raise the ante for a diplomatic solution and reinvigorated the CNN curve. It had been a quiet day in Sarajevo, in a city that had grown used to up to 12,000 shells a day. That Saturday in February was particularly quiet. There had been negotiations to keep it that way. A planned evacuation of the remainder of the city's Jewish community was to begin that morning. The Bosnian Serbs had agreed to keep the guns on the hills quiet for that one day so the buses could get out of town. The buses did move out of the old quarter of the city in the morning, and many Sarajevans were taking advantage of the quiet to do a little shopping on the black market. The stalls with mounds of expensive goods were crowded that day. By all accounts, there was only one mortar shell that hit the city that day, one shell fired, that hit the tin roof of a stall before it hit the ground, scattering shrapnel fragments that sheared through the bodies of the shoppers. Once again, we saw on television the real horrors of the 2-year siege. While the shelling through the winter had been particularly fierce, the mortar in the market came into our living rooms. The images of those deaths seemed to propel Western governments into action. Over the next few days, the Western Alliance proposed and carried out NATO's first successful ultimatum. The Russians placed peacekeepers in Sarajevo. Soon there was a ceasefire, and a British general, Sir Michael Rose, the UN commander of the besieged city, was seen walking in places that no one had walked for the past 2 years. Was it the CNN curve in operation again? Not really. While the Market Massacre might have been a catalyst, the movement for some kind of peace had been in the works for some time. There was enormous fear of sanctions in Zagreb. There was a realization, both in Western Europe and in Washington, that a diplomatic solution was preferable to a spring offensive that was in the works. There was a convention in Sarajevo of Bosnian Croats who had turned against the policy of their nationalist fellows in Mostar. But even as the ceasefire began to take hold, the inverse of the CNN curve had taken hold. As I left Sarajevo, the Serbs had attacked Gorazda, a designated United Nations safe area. The American Secretary of Defense said there would be no repeat of the Sarajevo ultimatum. This was a different situation, he said, and if the Serbs took Gorazda, then he would not interfere. The fact that the town was a UN safe area appeared to be irrelevant. The Ukrainian peacekeepers assigned to Gorazda weren't expected to be in place for a few more weeks. The shortage of peacekeepers remains a problem in ex-Yugoslavia. Had there been peacekeepers in the town when Gorazda was declared a safe zone, there's a good chance that the Bosnian Serbs would have thought twice about the assault. Thanks. I'd like to open up the floor to questions from all of you who think that television news can still propel government policy. 2 microphones.
You've had a broad experience with the CNN. I believe before that you were with, was it National Public Radio for a time, and now with ABC. I'm wondering if you could contrast among those 3 major media outlets the quality of the foreign coverage and how you see it evolving now in 1994.
Well, one thing you can say about the American media, it's a supermarket. And when I worked for National Public Radio, I used to like to say that that was the gourmet section. And in terms of foreign news, while we were cheap and small, we did more foreign news than most and tried to do it in an in-depth way. I think that the American networks are moving away from foreign news. CNN still has a commitment to the kind of coverage of a wide range of foreign events, in part because it has an international audience. It troubles me to come back after being out of the country for 11 years to have to work so hard at finding out what's going on outside of the United States. It's certainly not a trend that I applaud, and I think it's not simply an American phenomenon, but I think that a great part of Western Europe as well as America is focusing on itself after the end of the Cold War, and it doesn't appeal to my taste, but I think that's the way it is for a while. Quiet group tonight. I think you have to stand up and say your name.
Given the what you described as governments getting ahead of the CNN curve, and as a CNN reporter, I hate this term, but never mind.
It wasn't my term. It was a New Yorker term.
I'm curious how you see governments such as the U.S. being able to send their boys in if there is the possibility of body bags coming back.
It does raise a problem for them, and a researcher at the International Institute for Strategic Studies wrote an interesting paper on just that point. And what he says is that the kind of casualties that Americans are willing to take in a situation like Somalia or Bosnia are the same as they would for a natural disaster. They expect the same casualty figure if the National Guard went to California to help out with the earthquake. The problem is that's not what these things are. They are peacekeeping operations, and it requires a different kind of sell, if you will, by an American president in the way that George Bush was able, in a limited way, and I think probably for a limited amount of time, to be able to sell Americans on why we needed to be in Iraq. This administration has not tried to do. Now, we are very soon going to come down to the crunch point. America has pledged a rather large number of troops if there is a peace treaty in Bosnia. something like 20 to 50,000. That's a lot of people. And the preparation has not begun yet for that kind of deployment. It will be particularly hard after Somalia. Americans were horrified what they saw on their television screens in Somalia, and as far as I could see, no policy maker went out of their way to try to mitigate that shock and horror with what happened there. I think that Bosnia will be a very hard sell.
Hi, your description of the end of the curve struck me as a little bit morally neutral, I guess you could say. It's not clear to me whether you feel that the demise of the CNN curve is really some sort of progress, that the moral element of the fact that we're in an isolationist phase. I don't hear from you. I hear a very ambivalent feeling about that. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, you are understanding it. It's hard to say. I mean, one can be morally outraged about what has happened in a place like Yugoslavia, ex-Yugoslavia. I am conflicted myself about foreign policy by moral outrage. The problem with deploying troops for reasons of outrage rather than national security is the commitment is not very deep, and that you might be willing to kill for such a policy, but certainly not be willing to be killed. And Somalia was the perfect example of that. I certainly support the policy for the Iraqi Kurds, and it was a shame in the way that that was handled. They were encouraged to revolt, and then when they did, everybody was quite surprised. And oh yes, you guys, and you know there was a quick sort of patch up to do something about that. So I am conflicted myself about whether I think that television pictures should move governments to react or shouldn't. I suppose in a perfect world they wouldn't need the television pictures; they would already have a policy. The problem is that many times they don't, and that it takes that sort of light of publicity to make them move. I suppose at the same time it disturbs me that they've figured out how to ignore it. And so when it might be necessary, if there's another Iraqi Kurd situation, they will fold their arms and say, we'll wait this one out. I don't think that could happen again, to tell you the truth.
Deborah, let me ask you something which has troubled me a little bit. There's been a lot of criticism that the television pictures drive policy, but it seems to me that if the major Western governments had actually had policies, there wouldn't have been the vacuum into which the television pictures flow. And it seems to me that it's unfair to criticize the television pictures as driving policy. I mean, the problem, it seems to me, has been that there is no policy. There is no sense in the major Western governments, by which I mean America, France, and Britain. There's been no attempt to develop a consensus about what the strategic interests of the Western community are in the Balkans. I mean, many of us could articulate those quite well. But it seems to, I mean, is that a feeling you have, that as you cover this, there is a sense that there is no coherent sense of Western policy about what to do in the Balkans?
And now we have the worst of both worlds. We have no policy and we have no way to affect it with television images. And so I thought that a policy had begun in the last couple of weeks, that there had been some serious attention to moving, at least to make this a two-sided fight rather than a three-sided fight. If you look at some of the interviews with the American ambassador in Zagreb, Peter Galbraith, he very clearly says that's what we were trying to do. That's why we got the Muslims and the Croats together, because a three-sided fight was too difficult for us to manage. But then we didn't know what to do after that. But that's as far as they got. Even the people who had a notion of a policy, that is as far as they got. So that's what's troubling now, is no policy and no ability with television pictures to move it one way or the other.
I seem to recall that at the end of the Bush administration, there was a debate upon, with this new world order, whether or not we should be sort of like the world police, or, you know, that maybe in some situations, maybe it's not our place. So in this context of you saying, in some situations, CNN will propel world events, and now that's not happening anymore, how does that fit in with our responsibility to other nations? You know, what should the guidelines be for situations that we get involved in and are willing to risk American lives for, as opposed to situations where perhaps maybe we should sit it out, that it's not in Americans' best interest to become involved?
I think that debate is still an ongoing debate. I know that there has been a presidential directive that's overdue now, sort of the internal memo of the administration to itself, on what peacekeeping operations do we join up with? And they don't know. They have not figured it out and haven't written it down. And anybody who asks them, they say, ooh, we can't figure out the criteria. So the administration hasn't quite addressed it. There have been some bad examples. Somalia has let everybody know that there's limits to peacekeeping, that there are some things that we probably won't be doing. And Yugoslavia has been another test case. I tell you what you are beginning to hear in NATO partners is maybe the best thing for the Americans is, if they wouldn't mind, to contribute logistics, communications, that there may be other ways to work this out. If the American public is not convinced that we really do need to go to all these places, that's fine, except there are commitments that do have national security implications, and Yugoslavia is one of those. There's other things that we can do, but I think that the debate is ongoing. Could you say your name?
Yeah, Ines Rol. I am a little bit confused because if governments react or they act in the world's problems because of the images that the media can affect the public, and if they are reacting to that, I'm not sure if you really believe that it is like that. Because, for example, if the governments really did react to what the people thought about the images that they see on TV, maybe why do they react in some instances and why do they don't react in other instances? For example, in the Bosnian problem, there have been such horrible images and news and things that are always happening over there that has everybody horrified, and nothing is being done. And maybe in other circumstances, equally horrifying images, and something has been done. Do you think that it's really because of the images and the news, or it's because it's something else that is moving them to do something?
No, that's my point. I think that most policymakers were caught off guard in as short as 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, and have learned to not react to it. For those of us who believe that you could shape policy through journalism, and I'm not just talking about raw images, but that there was a debate that journalism played a part in, that you could go off to a place like Yugoslavia or Somalia or Georgia or Azerbaijan or, name your place, and that there was a role for journalism to shape public opinion, and that public opinion would in turn shape foreign policy. What I'm saying is, I don't think it happens anymore. I think that the CNN curve, that governments have learned to not be affected by those images and to not respond to the public outrage of them. Yes, I do. I think that both Somalia and what happened with the Kurds were two examples where they did.
Deborah, I'd say that to not respond should not actually be confused with having no policy. I think certainly from my experience as a fellow correspondent, it is now very clear that if you look back over the last 3 years, the policy was to do as little as possible.
That's
and that was
true.
a clear policy. It was designed to be minimalist at the lowest common denominator of agreement, to be seen to do something with the lowest risk and the lowest cost. And I think we all kidded ourselves at the time that what we were doing probably would force them to do something else. Which leads me on to another question, and we had quite a heated debate at the Schornstein-Burren Center today about this, about what happens now in terms of the impact of the kind of work that we're doing with the CNN curve or the live television curve from places like Bosnia and into the near abroad and into Africa and so on. Does it mean that perhaps the work we're doing is no longer as valuable as it used to be? In other words, it's not actually going to create priorities in crisis management, which it has done up to now.
That's, you know, it's why this has been on my mind lately, because you have to ask yourself, why do I do this? What's the point? And especially as the job gets more and more dangerous. And I think that sort of, you have to go back to sort of pre-Watergate days in American journalism and think about what the role of journalism was then. Is it less valuable? Probably not. I think that the job of informing remains the same. Does it have the same kind of impact? I'm not sure that it does. I'm really not sure that it does now. However, we're also talking about a world that is just far more complex than the one that we all covered just a few years ago. I mean, that's also part of the problem. How much impact did we really have during the Cold War in the kind of coverage that we provided? I think that what happened is there were maybe 2 short years where we really did believe that you could have enormous impact, and that time is now over, that we can't. I don't know if that answered your question,
No,
but I
I agree with you.
I think that it's a debate that all of us are having.
I'm wondering if you think that the historical verdict on the U.S. involvement in Somalia has already been definitively written. Is it really the debacle that some people make it out to be? Is it akin to U.S. involvement, say, in Beirut or Vietnam for that matter? Is it really a failure? Or was it simply a tactical failure, a battlefield tactical failure by a local commander, say, that exposed American lives to unnecessary danger, or an unfortunate set of circumstances that led to the deaths of a significant number of Americans in one day? It's been 2 weeks now since U.S. troops left Somalia, and the situation hasn't deteriorated to the status quo ante where you had 400,000 people, literally 1,000 people a day dying of starvation. And I'm just concerned that there's this consensus that's developed that says, oh, Somalia is bad, we don't want to do that anymore. And it's sort of setting a precedent, and I hear that often enough, and I'm wondering if that question has been definitively settled, or are we yet to see what is going to happen if it in fact deteriorates, say, in the next few months to what had happened before George Bush sent in the troops. Then one could say, yes, you know, maybe those kinds of situations are situations we should stay away from. But if some semblance of stability was to evolve there, would the verdict be open to reconsideration? I guess that's what.
Well, first of all, that would be a lovely outcome if that happened. The truth is that we were down past 1,000 a day before the Marines landed on the beach in December. It wasn't perfect, and it could have deteriorated at any time, but the fact is that the corner had been turned on the most wrenching of the starvation. It was still a country with no government. It was still a capital run by gangsters. I suppose the reason that I worry about the precedent of Somalia is not so much even about Somalia, but what it says about peacekeeping in this new world order. That Somalia was supposed to be a model. Chapter 7 is an important precedent, and so was nation building. But what we discovered is that there was no will for nation building, that it had been done haphazardly, it hadn't been completely thought out, that there was two strains of thought between the UN and the Americans, because what we've had in the last 2.5 years are strange marriages of institutions and governments. The marriage between NATO and the UN has been an important relationship. Sarajevo in some ways is a sideshow to that. In Somalia, what you had was a kind of dance between the United Nations and the Americans. Were we going to wear blue hats? Weren't we going to wear blue hats? Did we have the will to have a peacekeeping operation that had this government building component? And the answer is no. And what I am concerned about, and why in my mind it's a failure, is that we may find that we don't have peacekeeping operations in countries with no governments, and that list is growing. Places like Afghanistan, places like Somalia, places like Liberia, that governments will recognize that it's too dangerous, it's too sure of failure, that you can't really solve anything unless you have the will to rebuild a government, that these are man-made famines or man-made humanitarian aid problems, they're quagmires, and so they are off the map, these countries. And that's the failure of Somalia, not specifically about what happens there, but the policy implications that came out of that experience.
First, I wanted to say how much of a fan I am of all the years that I've listened.
Do you know my mom?
My question has to do with whether you might compare Republican administrations and Democratic administrations and how they react to the CNN curve, whether they're more reactive, less reactive, whether the Democratic administration is starting to react more like the Republican administrations used to, or whether you think there's any difference in
those are really hard questions. For a person who's been out of the country, it's a good question though, but I've been out of the country for a long time, so it's hard for me to know, A, and B, I think that this is a new way the world works. The Bush administration sort of got the tail end of that phenomenon. The Clinton administration got it full force and had to learn how to deal with it. So I think it's like comparing apples and oranges, because what you've got is, before Cold War, after Cold War, or middle of Cold War, and that's really where the line is. It has nothing to do with being Democrats or Republicans. It has to do with, when you were born. Let's see how the next guys deal with it, and then then we can write, doctoral theses about that.
I was wondering if you think one factor which might be leading to the government's ability to sort of ignore all these pictures might be like American skepticism that the pictures always adequately represent what's going on. I guess we all hear these myths when you see the pictures of the body bags, that yes, they're of the people of the right nationality, but they didn't happen 2 weeks ago, they happened 3 months ago, and sometimes we're left to sort of sort out, are the pictures really adequately representing what's going on there? And if in fact they're not, then they could just be tremendously heartbreaking, but not completely fitting the bill.
I'm not sure about that. I think that most Americans believed what they saw from Somalia. And I think that most Americans believed, and so did the administration, believe what they were seeing from Yugoslavia. I think that's a fair criticism in some domestic news coverage. But I think in foreign news, and especially because so much of television these days is live, really honest to God live. But I think that it is a belief in the pictures that you're seeing. Did you say your name?
Alan Benjamin. I was wondering if you were to look at, compare Panama and Grenada and the controls on the media that developed by the government during that period of time, and look at what you were saying in your discussion today, and how you feel, what has happened in those years. I mean, was it a policy of the Bush administration in controlling what went on in Panama so that the American people didn't find out what actually went on, and the tragedy that occurred with a great many of the Panama people? And has there been this change in the last 4 years that that the media has now become a more powerful influence, as you see in this CNN curve. I'm a little bit confused as what has there been a change in the whole implications of the whole viewpoint of the CNN curve in changing policy?
It's an interesting point that you raised because, I mean, you know, in sort of thinking about how governments are influenced by the pictures that they see, of course, I'm thinking about the very places where there were no controls on the press, in places like Somalia and in Bosnia and in Kurdistan. There was no American military that said, I'm sorry, but we'll have to read that copy before you can send it back to your desk. And that really does make a difference in the way what this gentleman was talking about in credibility. You know, this is live stuff. There's nobody doing any censors. I can't really speak to press relations in Panama and Grenada. I didn't cover either one of those. I wasn't even close to it. I was on the other side of the world when that all was going on. So I don't really know, but that was mostly done by the military, as I know. It was the same system that was established during Desert Storm. So it's not really the administration who does that, but it's the military.
Can I just ask one follow-up? I wanted to ask you, since you've been away and recently been back in the United States, taking a step back and looking at the news and the national news, do you find that there's a lack of independent voices and a lack of variety of opinions on the national news, specifically Nightline and NBC, ABC, and CBS News? How do you feel when you come back here and you look at and you listen to some of the different broadcasts in the media?
I haven't been here enough to really know that, but I know that I have to work a whole lot harder to get the kind of news that I'm interested in. I just have to work harder than I did when I was abroad. I'm particularly interested in foreign news, and that takes some work.
Thank you. Simon.
Deborah, you seem to be saying that journalism exists to affect policy. And you seem to express disappointment that journalists today may not have the same opportunities to affect policy as perhaps they did, you said, prior to Watergate. I would like to ask you why you think journalism or journalists should affect policy and why the old yardstick of just, quote, covering the news is not sufficient.
I sort of felt that affecting policy had to do with covering the news. And it's a point well taken, that in a way is our job. However, when there are such blatant, terrible things going on in the world, one begins to think that by simply showing those things, that someone will stop it, that genocide is bad, and that if enough people see it, that it will be stopped. And it's shocking when it doesn't happen. Your point about what journalism is for is well taken. And I didn't want to suggest that our job is to change policy, but we certainly are part of the debate over policy. And I think that that is less and less. Yes.
If a journalist is trying to
Name,
affect,
please?
Fred Tausch, if a journalist is trying to affect policy, and if he is on a battlefield, isn't he in a sense a hostage subject to being targeted by anybody who's unhappy with his effort to change policy? You started out by talking about the, I guess, fairly recent hazardous nature of journalism, and I wondered whether that is something new and if it's appropriate. Do you see anything wrong with somebody who's unhappy with the effort to change policy, to affect policy, targeting journalism? Don't they become hostages in effect?
Let's define our terms here. And I suppose it's sort of one's internal dialogue and one's external dialogue. You are on a mountaintop in Iraq, and you have done your best to get across the Turkish border, and you hired a translator, and it's not pleasant to do it, but you do it. And you report what you see, thousands of Iraqi Kurds, coming up the mountaintop, fleeing an army that's behind them, willing to kill every single one of them, and that you report exactly that, exactly what you see. Now, That's the job of a journalist, reporting the news. There is something inside you as a human being that says, and somebody ought to do something about this. It's not that you put it in your piece. It's not that you write it. But the very fact that you spend enough time to get across that border to do it is because at some moment you think, and something should happen
I'm
here.
not objecting to your doing it. I wondered whether a journalist who does that objects to being a valid target by somebody who doesn't want them to do it.
Yeah, I think that it's fair to object.
Seriously? I mean, should a journalist have some kind of immunity? Should they wear a cap, the baseball cap, and expect people not to shoot at them? Or should they, in fact, expect that if they are affecting policy, that the people who don't like that are going to actually target that baseball cap?
Well, the point is that they don't anymore. That most governments have figured out how to not be affected by the kind of images that are being shown on American television. So we're back in the neutral zone again.
And the journalist isn't intimidated either. Is that you think journalists are not intimidated by the sense that they could, in fact, be appropriately targeted by somebody?
Absolutely intimidated, but if you're implying that it makes us change our stories, I'm not altogether sure. Certainly in the case of Bosnia, if you felt that way, you didn't go. And there were no...
That right away changes the reporting, doesn't it? Because there's a selection as to who goes.
Yes, that's true. I'm not sure if it changes the reporting. Why do you think it changes the reporting?
Well, any selection is going to put a bias in it. It's going to be the people who have more of a conviction, who really want to change the, affect the agenda more, are more likely to go than the ones who are just going there as part of a job.
As we look, earlier in the evening, we had a debate at the Neiman House about how foreign corresponding works, and we all agreed that less people are as interested as they used to be because it's very difficult for your spouse to find a job abroad or your kids to get in school abroad. So if you're suggesting that all selection affects journalism, then the fact that more single people are foreign correspondents across the board then affects what we read in our newspapers and our magazines and our televisions, then that's true because all things are selections. 10 years ago, women weren't foreign correspondents, so that was a selection, and that also affected the way that things were written, do you think?
Sure. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Larry Ritchie. I would like to ask a question that I know I can't answer and may be very difficult to consider, but returning to Mr. Kalb's point about covering the news, it seems to me that as the media has grown over the decades and the scope of potential news sources has increased to become global daily, if not by the minute or the half hour. And the human mind can process information no more quickly than it could when people lived within their own communities. And as there are so many stories, so many famines, so many wars, and there is such a feeling of power and validity in what the media has to say, is there a danger perhaps, or is there an issue concerning the selectivity of the news? The fact that only a few stories can be reported, that lead stories tend to become very popular or pursued for weeks or months, and that the public might gain an impression that this is the news, this is the famine, this is the war, this is the assassination. And if we can only do something about that, the world will basically be all right. The television will then say, everything is good now. When in fact the world is such a crazy place that each news broadcast might be prefaced by saying, there were 500 assassinations today which we could not cover. There were 400,000 deaths related to smoking, and the famines around the world killed 1 million people today. And what you're about to see is a small part of that story. This is an impossible question, but I think it's important. Could you possibly speak to it?
No.
I understand.
And certainly not as well as you did. And, you know, it's a point well taken. The news is much more important than the gentleman before you.
May I ask a simpler question then? A while ago you were talking about your own career as a journalist and your reasons for pursuing it into the future. Can you speak to this question from a personal point of view as you approach your own newscasts, your own reporting? How do you see these things on a daily basis? Do they affect you at all, or do you have your own personal questions which direct your desire to improve the media from your own perspective?
I think as a journalist, you are always asking yourself, why do I do this? And what is it that I'm doing out there? And, you know, am I still saving American democracy by engaging in the practice of journalism. I think any professional is always asking themselves, why am I doing this? And it's Yugoslavia and the experiences of ex-Yugoslavia, it's been on my mind about how policy is shaped by images and then how it stopped being shaped by images. That doesn't lead me to, I don't want to do this anymore, or I do. I think it's just an ongoing sort of observation and debate about the way that the media works and watching it. It's sort of your other profession when you do this for a living, because whenever you show up, particularly at these big stories, you really see, sort of the internal workings of story selection and so I haven't even come close to addressing either one of your questions.
No, you have. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Robert Marquand. I was struck by your analysis of the end of the curve. As I understand, or the leveling off of the curve, as I understand, your feeling is that Western policymakers have figured out that images drive news and policy and so forth, and they are now anticipating this. And part of your example, I guess, was that the Sarajevo massacre had that the response to something, a French-U.S. initiative, shall we say, was already in the works. Would you say that the Sarajevo massacre provided a catalyst for taking some action? Wouldn't it be fair to say that that was true, and that in a sense those television pictures did have some meaning in terms of moving that ultimatum, that NATO ultimatum ahead? That's one question. I have a follow-up.
Because I have believed for some time that the CNN curve wasn't in operation, when I went to Sarajevo this time, and I came back today, I was asking everybody, okay, if it wasn't the Market Massacre, what was it? I mean, peace is not like a light switch. You can't turn it off and on. Everything happened so quickly after the Market Massacre. At the same time, Clinton was saying, well, if those people don't quit killing each other, they'll still kill each other. I mean, it was peculiar those first couple of days after the Market Massacre. And the more you examined it, the more you asked people, what was it? What changed? How is it possible that within days that General Rose was able to do what he did, that all of these things happened? And then you start seeing lists of what was going on. It was a long process over the last year. One of the things that I was startled to discover is that what's on everybody's list is a meeting that happened in Sarajevo with Bosnian Croats. And they all put it on the list. And, it would take too long to sort of go over the details of why that was so important. But it was a process that began last year, where, in effect, and in short form, the majority took back the momentum. I mean, the war in ex-Yugoslavia has been carried out by minority nationalists in each population. And in some ways, the majority got it back and said, that's enough. But it wasn't the Market Massacre that made them all wake up one day and say, oh, I get it, okay.
No, I wasn't suggesting that it was. I was suggesting it as a catalyst. I was suggesting that it was part of what happened.
I would suggest the catalyst was for us.
Yeah.
What the Market Massacre did was,
meaning who?
Us American viewers, was for us to say, oh yeah, I remember, and to focus once again on what was happening in Sarajevo so that we noticed the change. That a catalyst perhaps in that it happened on this day instead of 2 weeks from now. That what the Market Massacre did is not only speeded up time, but made us focus in on it again. But it wasn't the reason.
Yeah, there was a lightning response in some ways. There was I was in Vienna at the time. I'm also a reporter, and it did seem as if that did act. And I was just wondering, in terms of your statement about the curve. I guess my second question is, it struck me that we were all talking about the CNNization and so forth of news. That in fact there has been a curve, and it has been saturating the media marketplace, and policymakers have responded to it, and in a sense, it's become almost a normalized situation. And I wonder whether or not, the what we think of as the ending of a curve is simply something that has become quite normal. However, where I want to take that question is that in Bosnia, and you mentioned the Kurds as well in Iraq, it seems as if a great deal did not get covered in Yugoslavia, one of the best covered wars ever in Europe. Yet, as we know, the ethnic cleansing took place off camera.
Mm-hmm.
The ethnic cleansing continues to take place off camera.
Off-camera.
Look at what doesn't get reported from the former Yugoslavia. I just wrote an editorial about Kurds in Turkey. Who has seen very many pictures of what's happening with the Turkish assault there, which is quite substantial? I'm wondering, I guess this is by way of saying, how do you respond to that question? And the second thing is sort of technical or kind of, what is your feeling about the difference between television and radio reporting in that kind of environment? How easy is it to get in to
One
places?
has pictures and one doesn't.
Well, yeah, but it's a different. Let's see. Yeah, I'd like to talk to you after that. But I mean, it's a different methodology, isn't it? Bringing a crew in is different than if you're a radio reporter, you can come in and you can. I'm just wondering about the question of access. Is it easier to get in and get that story from the rest of the former Yugoslavia, shall we say, or Turkey, or someplace without a big camera crew?
Yeah, and in a funny way, it did skew the coverage of that war because the war was Sarajevo, because that's where everybody went. And if you knew anything at all about that war, that's what you knew. So when Sarajevo got fixed and there was a ceasefire there, people were quite shocked to find out that there was a war in other parts of Bosnia. And the other thing about coverage there is hardly any American organization had an accredited full-time correspondent. Most of the war was covered by freelancers or people who, went there on their own. It was a peculiar war in the way that it was covered.
Pressure is on. Deborah, my name is Jackie Ganem, and I'm a sympathetic ear to coming back from overseas and not being able to find foreign news. So just curious, actually, as to what, you've obviously given this a lot of thought, what types of things do you think will motivate that to happen in the media? Because it is definitely an issue, especially if it isn't the topic of the day, and just nothing exciting happened today in Lebanon, but you'd like to find out something about what's actually happening, or Bulgaria, or some other places where what's happening is important, but it's not sensationalized in any way.
I have two thoughts about it. One is that it's simply a phase that we're going through, and that at some moment we will look up over the coastline and say, gee, a lot of things have changed over there, and that it will become fashionable again for foreign corresponding and for people to pay attention. And two, like everything that happens in America, there will be specialized markets to deal with people who want that kind of news. There will be programs that specialize in foreign news. National Public Radio 10 years ago had one like that. And then we got into the mass market foreign corresponding business, and that show went away. And I think that these things sort of come and go. I mean, in the end, this is commercial. That's what we're talking about in America, is commercial media. And if it sells, then perhaps we will have more foreign news.
Thank you for your participation. And thank you for being here.